The third man argument, or the third man problem, is pretty much unambiguously the most important objection to a particular theory in metaphysics. That theory is the theory of forms, but let's not get to that theory yet. Incidentally, on the topics playlist on this channel, there is or will be at least one video on this subject, on the subject of universals and forms, and you can go to the topics playlist and watch it, unless it's not there yet. If it's not there, subscribe, and it will eventually turn up. Now let's explain what universals are, and then explain what forms are, and then look at the third main objection and say something about who considered this objection to the forms. Universals are shared properties of things. So this thing has the property of being a pen, and so does this. Property here, property here. They share this property. Property in both places. Now, since physical things don't exist in two places at the same time, these properties don't either. And so these properties exist, but they're non-physical realities, and we call them universals. It's one of the most interesting ways of objecting to the thesis that all is matter. Now, Plato, Aristotle, and various other philosophers have believed in the existence of universals. Plato's theory is that the universals exist by themselves, or that the universals are derived from things that exist by themselves. So here's a pen, but there is such a thing as a sublime, perfect pen. Penness itself existing independently of all pens, from which these pens get their penness. So that's forms theory. Now, according to the third man objection, as it's called, if the form of penness exists, it must be a pen itself. It must have the property of penness. Even though it is penness itself, it also has the property of penness. And that means that there must be another form explaining it, because the whole point of forms, the whole point of universals, is to explain the fact that things have properties. And so, if penness is a pen, it's going to have another penness behind it. And alongside the second form, for the same reason, a third form will always make its appearance. This phraseology comes from Plato's Parmenides dialogue, by the way, as if I recall correctly, it was published by Hackett, and this is in the Complete Works of Plato. I do not recall the translator, I'm sorry to say. Alongside the second form, a third form will always make its appearance. It's like getting bogged down doing your taxes. There's always another form behind every form you're working with. Only with your taxes, you do eventually usually come to the end. But with metaphysics, it doesn't work that way, at least not with forms theory, according to the third main objection. Every form will be the property that it is, but it will also have that property, so there needs to be another form behind it. Thus goes the third man objection. And I think primarily the problem is not that we have an infinite regress and an objection you may be familiar with from people like Aristotle, that an actual infinite doesn't make any sense, and you can study the thought experiment of Hibbert's Hotel on the internet about the problem with the infinite regress. But I don't think that's the major issue here. I think the major issue here is one of explanation. The reason we posit universals is to explain properties like penness, but nothing is explained because the explanation can never get started if behind every form there's another form, and behind that form another form, and so on. Nothing is ever explained. No property is explained if explanation can't get started, because every form needs another form in order to have the property that it has, which it must have in order to be the form that it is. Now, Aristotle employs this objection against Plato's forms theory. He does this several times in several different ways in his book, The Metaphysics. For example, he says universals cannot be substances. If universals are substances, then since substances have properties, the universals will have properties, and they will have the properties that they are there to explain in the first place, and so nothing will be explained, and the third man problem will follow. Again, he says, suchnesses cannot be thisnesses. A suchness is a property, a suchness, a way something is. A thisness is a thing, a something that has a way that it is. A thisness has a suchness. But if suchnesses are thisnesses, then the third man problem will follow. Every suchness will have will be a thisness, but will also, because it's a thisness, have its own suchness, and there will need to be another suchness to explain it, and nothing is explained, nothing makes sense. And so Aristotle says the best thing to do is just reject the idea of the forms. Now, that does not mean rejecting the idea of universals. But it's important to know that the third main objection, though Aristotle does use it against Plato, does appear in Plato. In the Parmenides dialogue, Plato employs, or at least considers, the third main objection. Now, this can mean one of two things, and it definitely means a third thing. It could mean that Plato knew there was a problem with forms theory, and himself eventually probably rejected it. Another thing it might mean is just that he knew there was a problem and thought there was a solution. That's a question for hardcore studies in metaphysics and hardcore studies in Plato, but what it definitely means is that Plato was aware of the problem and knew it was worth thinking about. Finally, one thing I haven't explained is why on earth is this objection called the third man objection? I think it's because in one of Aristotle's examples, he considered the form of man. You take a man and you consider how he gets his humanity, and you assume there is a form of man behind him, but that form of man, being a form, is itself a man and must therefore have another form behind it, a third man. I think that's where the name for the objection comes from.